Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. A little while ago when I reviewed the Topping E50 and L50 stack, there was a mystery amp included in that review that I couldn't talk about too much at the time. But today here I am revealing what that amplifier was, and it was the Geshelli Labs E2 amplifier, or the Erish 2. I reviewed the original Erish some time ago and I really enjoyed what it offered for the price, and so I was excited to see the E2 come onto the market, and even more excited when I got a chance to play with it. So if you want to find out my thoughts on the E2 and why I've got a stack of multiple products on my desk, watch on and I'll do my best to answer all the questions. As you've probably already gathered from the footage you just saw, the E2 is available in a couple of variants. You can get the old style, normal metal case with the plexiglass front and back, or you can get this beautiful wooden case with plexiglass front and back that's recessed into the timber. Both are the E2, both are identical on the inside, it's just the aesthetics that's changing. And with that in mind, it's worth talking about pricing. The E2 comes in at about $230 is the prediction, and I say prediction because at the time I'm recording this, that's where Geshelli Labs think they're going to have landed on the pricing. The reason they're uncertain is because there's lots of parts shortages at the moment in the world, and that is getting in the way for them trying to find things like power supplies, the controller chips that go within the amplifier. All sorts of things are proving a bit difficult. But expect a retail price of about $230 for the regular aluminium and plexiglass version, and then an additional upgrade cost if you want to go to the timber. With the timber, there'll be variations on the price because it depends on the availability of the different wood types. The amplifier that I have here in the timber is the poplar variety. And I know that some people, when I put this up on the community page, were wanting to see more photos of different colour schemes, different timbers, and I'm sure Geshelli Labs will provide that in the future. Unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly which colours look good or what each timber is going to look like. All I can tell you is there'll be a range of choices, there'll be different prices for the timbers, and they will look different both from variety of timber to variety of timber, but also within each variety, there's always going to be variation. You can get lighter and darker versions of the same timber depending on the tree it came from. So expect to pay roughly $50 more for different timbers as a starting point, but do know that it could be higher for the more obscure and harder to source timbers. The best place to find out about the look of these in terms of the different choices of aluminium and perspex colours, and then also the different timber types, is on the Geshelli website, and I'll put a link down below as usual where you can go and check that out. For now though, having covered off some of the cosmetic stuff, let's talk about the amp, what it is, how it performs, all that good stuff. And probably the best way to do that is with a quick tour of the amp itself. The front panel, as usual, is very straightforward. We've got a power button that also cycles through the LED colours. We've got an input gain button which changes between the lowest gain setting and the high gain setting. You've got 4-pin XLR, and then you've got your volume pot, and that's it. There's no single-ended output on the E2, just like there wasn't on the original Erish. So this is an amplifier for balanced users only. If you want a single-ended amplifier, that's where you'd go and look at something like the Arkle. And if you're wondering where these unusual names have come from, check out my interview with Geshelli Labs here on the channel where I asked them that specific question. Around the back here, we've got a pair of XLR inputs. So again, it's only a balanced amplifier, balanced in, balanced out. But unlike the original Erish, we now also have balanced outputs for studio monitors or other preamp functionality. So you can run this into a tube amp, for instance, if it's balanced. You can run it to active monitors, any other active speakers, whatever you like. This can now be a preamp for balanced connections only. You can buy transformers that are designed to turn a balanced output like this into single-ended, but I've had mixed experience with them depending on the product you're plugging the single-ended end into. It's produced hum and noise for me in the past, not with this amp but with other amps. So I'm not going to guarantee you could use it with single-ended. It is possible with transformers that it might work, but I would prefer to suggest that it is a balanced only preamp just for the sake of safety. The final thing to mention is we've got a power input on the back. Once again, this uses a nice compact wall wart power supply. And that's all there is to it. It's a very, very simple amp, but that's part of its magic. It's also part of what keeps its cost so very affordable. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of specs before we get into some of the deeper design questions compared to the original Erish and sound quality is to mention that this is rated to deliver 2 watts at 32 ohms. And that means it's going to comfortably drive pretty much any headphone you're ever going to need it to. I was able to comfortably drive the Susfaras to normal, regular listening levels and still have plenty of headroom left for the sake of it being at good quality. But having said that, I'm not recommending that this is an amp you should buy for a headphone of that level. This is an amp that can run anything, but you shouldn't expect it to perform at the level of something like the Burson Soloist GT that I reviewed recently, even the regular Soloist 3XP. It's an excellent amp, as I'll talk about soon, but it is still a relatively budget amp, so do come in with those expectations in mind. And as always, I'll provide some comparisons shortly to put it into context. And while we're talking about power, it's also worth noting that the E2 does work nicely with IEMs, albeit with fairly limited volume range. I was able to get out of channel imbalance with things like the IE900s, but at the same time, you don't get a huge amount of play. The good news is there's no sense of hiss, the background is very much black, but you don't get a lot of volume wiggle. So it's not really an amplifier I would choose for IEMs, but it can drive them in a pinch with no problems that I heard from the IEMs I've got on hand here. So at this point, we've got a fully balanced amp that's now also a preamp. Now, one thing worth mentioning with the preamp functionality is it doesn't allow you to switch that off. And that to me is a bit of a shame because it does mean that you're either going to use this as a preamp or you're going to use it as a headphone amp, because you can't be listening to headphones if you've got active speakers plugged in as well. You're going to be getting sound out of both. So that is a bit of a shame. It would have been nice to see a switch for the preamp functionality on there, but unfortunately that's not there. So do think of it accordingly. It's a preamp or a headphone amp, unless you've got some way to switch off whatever the preamp is driving. But anyway, putting that aside now, we've got a headphone amp here that's got plenty of power. It's a lovely design, at least I like it. It's very well priced and it's fully balanced. So for those of you looking for a budget, entry-level type balanced amplifier, this could be a great choice, assuming it sounds good, and we'll get to that in a moment. Before we do though, I do want to talk briefly about what's changed from the original Erish. And that's why I've got this stack on my desk. As you can see here, the original Erish was tiny. It had all the same features except no preamp output, and that's largely where the extra chassis size is coming from, as I can tell. If you look at them side by side, it's a significant difference both in terms of the width of the device, but also the depth of the device too. So it's both a bit shorter, but also narrower sideways. For those looking for something super compact, the change is probably not so good, but for those of you using things like the J2 DAC, it's now a perfect match. So you've now got a DAC and a balanced amp stack that sit together beautifully. And just to remind you, the J2 does have balanced outputs as well as single-ended. So it's a really nice stack that you can make now if you want to go full Geshelli Labs. Now, while we're talking about all this, you might be wondering why I've got a standard E2 in the aluminium case as well as the timber one. And the reason for that is that Gino and Sherry were kind enough to reach out to me when they were designing the E2 and ask me to take a listen and share some feedback. To be really clear, I had no hand in the design of the amplifier. It was more that they sent me the prototype before it was launched to see what I thought of it and to see if there were any major glaring issues. And that's where this beastie here comes in. This is actually a prototype. But the good news is it sounds identical to the finished version. And the reason I say that's good news is because it sounds wonderful. The biggest changes from the original Erish, based on my discussion with Gino, was changes to the actual power supply implementation from the original Erish to the E2. And it's pretty astounding when you're about to hear what I'm going to say, the fact that power supply changes only could lead to such a big improvement. The E2 is a significant upgrade from the original Erish, and I love the original Erish, but the E2 is bonkers. The sound from the E2 is smooth, it's clean, it's spacious. It's one of the least op-amp sounding amps that I've ever heard. And when I'm talking about op-amps in this context, I mean integrated chip style op-amps. So we're not talking about things like the Burson op-amps or the Sparkos Labs or the Staccatos. We're talking about the normal chip style op-amps. The changes that Gino has implemented from the Erish to the E2 are a major upgrade. It is still, as I said before, a relatively budget amp, and you should go in with expectations of it performing at or a little bit above its budget, but within that budget, it is absolutely excellent. As I covered off in my L50 review, I think it comfortably beats that, and I'll revisit that in just a moment, but let's start with the most obvious comparison, and that's to begin against the original Erish amplifier. So in putting these two up against one another side by side, as I've already said, the E2 is a good head and shoulders above the original. The original Erish had a little bit of extra sense of bass presence or thump from it compared to the E2, whereas the E2 now comes across with a slightly more neutral signature. And that's not to say that one of them measures more neutral than the other in terms of frequency response. It's more about the character of the sound delivery, and that's true for most amplifiers. Most amplifiers will measure flat from 20 Hz through to 20 kHz. It's more in terms of the character of the sound, where things might be thicker or thinner, more edgy, more smooth. Those are the sorts of things I'm talking about here, not actual frequency response changes. But the general character of the original Erish was a little bit richer and warmer. It gave a slightly greater sense of bass thump to it, whereas the E2 now has a bit more mid-range balance to it, and therefore an overall more neutral sound, I believe. It's not to say that either is good or bad in that regard, but there is a little bit of a difference. Something else that slight change in character does is also adjust the soundstage a little bit. The original Erish had a somewhat triangular soundstage, but it was fairly flat. There wasn't a great deal of depth, as is pretty common for budget amps, and particularly budget amps using integrated op-amps. The E2's more neutral overall sound, with a slightly better sense of mid-range emphasis in comparison to everything else, means that the soundstage is now probably a little bit more intimate, but at the same time it's a more natural circular sort of shape, so it tends to wrap around the listener more, whereas the original Erish sits back a bit and is just a little bit triangular. Something else that the E2 does though is it brings a more sharp and clean focus on the image. Individual sounds are better separated and the overall imaging is a little bit more focused than the original Erish. And whilst I say a little bit, it's a significant improvement. I'm not suggesting that they're worlds apart, but the difference is big enough that it's really clear. One final point of difference is I found that the E1, as well as having that slight sense of bass character emphasis, it's also got a slightly drier upper register. That can initially come across as there being extra detail and clarity in the upper mids, but I actually think it's more that the E2 is cleaner and smoother, and therefore all the detail is still there, but it's not being accidentally emphasized by any sense of grain or dryness in the sound. To me, it's a really easy choice. Between the original Erish and the E2 is clearly the better amplifier. The Erish is still a really solid performer, but those changes that Gino's implemented in the power supply do definitely show through. It's improved its overall tonal balance, it's improved its natural sense of space and size of soundstage, not by making it bigger, but by making it a more natural shape, and also separating sounds better. These are all attributes I've come to expect when going from a lower quality to a higher quality product. And so it says to me that the E2 is definitely an improvement, both subjectively but also objectively. What I'm hearing speaks to an improved design. And so now let's briefly revisit the Topping L50 as another comparison that's in a similar ballpark to the E2, and also one that many people will be thinking about buying. If you want the full rundown of this comparison, do go and check out the L50 review if you haven't already. But to summarize it, what I found in comparing the two was that the E2 for me was smoother, more refined, there was a better sense of space and a better sense of overall separation of sounds within the overall presentation. It was just hands down a better amp. More engaging, more fun, and it sounded technically a better amplifier. So as I said, if you want more detail than that, do go check out the L50 review. The E2 here is what I was referring to there as the mystery amplifier. And so now let's turn to another comparison in the form of the SMSL SH-8s. And I've chosen this because the L50, the SH-8s and the E2 are kind of all three really good options in that balanced budget amplifier market. The SH-8s also retails at $230, putting it right on par with the E2. So I was keen when testing these out to hear if they were able to compete with one another, albeit being slightly different sounding amps, but whether I thought they were comparable or if one was clearly better than the other. And I was quite surprised to hear that the SH-8s actually came across as the slightly thicker and warmer sounding amp here. It's not an overly thick and warm sounding amp, but the sense of clarity and neutrality from the E2 is really impressive at the price. It's never harsh, it's never dry, but it does come across sounding very natural, very clear, and very transparent. On top of that, I also felt like the E2 just extended a bit better in the treble. It just seemed to capture the upper registers, the breathiness, and the air in recordings. The E2 just brought that out a bit better without ever overemphasizing it. And once again, just like with the L50, the E2 came across more spacious, more smooth, with a better sense of separation of sounds. It did everything better once again. And so at this point, I was really impressed with what I was hearing. Often when I compare different comparable amplifiers, it comes down to a case where I'll say to you, this one's good if you want this, and this one's good if you want that. With the E2 though, I do feel like I would comfortably say to someone, if you want the best balanced headphone amplifier at around $230, just buy this one. The others really aren't worth considering because the L50 and the SH-8s just fall short of this. Now, if you've got a bit more money to spend, that might be a different story where you can start to think about things like the Schiit Jotunheim 2, which I don't own, so I can't compare them. I'm sorry about that. It would have been a really interesting comparison. And I also had to draw the line at how many comparisons I put in, so I haven't put this up against the Asgard 3. What I can tell you from knowing both amplifiers intimately is that the E2 is a more neutral sounding amp. The Asgard 3 is a richer, warmer, more fun sounding amp. It does have a better sense of depth and layering of sounds than the E2 can do, but both of them are excellent. This is purely balanced, the Asgard 3 is purely single-ended, so factor that into your decision-making process. Also, aesthetics and design style are very different too, so that's a part of why I didn't go into too much depth comparing the two of those. Instead, I did do one final comparison, and that was to see just how good the E2 is. And to work that out, I put it up against the $600 Singxer SA-1. The SA-1 has many advantages here. It costs a whole lot more than double the price of the E2. It's also a fully discrete design with no integrated op amps. So it should have absolutely wiped the floor with the E2, and it was comfortably better than the E2. I'm not for a second going to suggest that the E2 was on the same level, but what was incredible was just how close the E2 got at the price. While the SA-1 is just a little tiny bit smooth and warm, or rich is probably a better term than warm, it's a little bit smooth and rich. The E2 does feel like it's the more truly neutral sounding amp. Again, I'm not talking frequency response, just the character of the sound comes across a little bit more neutral and transparent from the E2. I also felt like the E2 provided a slightly better sense of clarity and transparency in the upper registers, so your upper mids through to your treble, things sounded a tiny bit clearer from the E2. I should mention at this time, the modification of the SA-1, which I posted about recently, wasn't included here. So this is comparing the stock SA-1 with the E2. Where things did start to swing back towards the SA-1's favour though, was in areas like just the overall naturalness of sound. I couldn't actually put into my notes something that I specifically thought was better. It wasn't like it was the transients were better, or the mid-range was better, or the treble was better. There was just something kind of intangible that was better about the SA-1's presentation, and I'm putting it down to the fact that it's a discrete design versus an op-amp, an integrated op-amp design. Somehow, listening to vocals, other instruments, the SA-1 just came across a little tiny bit more natural and lifelike. The E2 was amazing, but if I had to sort of close my eyes and see which one was the most like I was sitting in the room with the musicians, somehow the SA-1 got that. Another area where the SA-1 was improved over the E2 was in its ability to create layers in the sound. So generally discrete designs done well will produce a better sense of depth and layering than the integrated op-amp designs. and that's definitely true in the case of the SA-1. On some tracks, the difference was fairly minimal, but on other tracks, like for instance I Don't Believe by Paul Simon, on that track the difference was quite significant. You could really hear the SA-1 stretching the sound out, giving you lots of space between instruments, and the E2 couldn't quite keep up in that regard. It still sounded great, but it couldn't match the space of the SA-1. Ultimately, if it came down to a choice between the two, I would absolutely choose the Singxer SA-1 every single time if I had both in front of me to choose, but given the price, the E2's performance was absolutely astounding. This is an incredible amp that I've actually used on a regular basis when I'm just doing casual listening. I've used it as part of my testing rig for the Arias, the upcoming review of the Apos Caspians, I've tried it with the Susvaras, the Mesa Elites. It's just really comfortable driving anything at all and driving it beautifully. So if you're in the market for a budget, balanced headphone amp and or preamp, like I said, with the caveat that you can't switch off the preamp outputs, this is an absolute winner of a product. Now you may know that I'm a bit of a fan of Geshelli Labs. I think Gino and Sherry are fantastic, but I do want to make it really clear there's no kickbacks, there's no affiliation, I had no hand in the design of this, I was just lucky enough to hear it early. On top of that, if you go and look at something like my review of the Topping L50, I've comfortably said there that I think the E50 is a better DAC than something like the J2. So I'm not a fanboy of Geshelli, I'm not automatically going to say good things, it's just that the E2 really is special. This is an amp where for me, if you've got say $300 to spend, you're looking for the best bang for buck in terms of a balanced amplifier, you could not go wrong buying yourself an E2. So if that sounds good to you, I will put links down below through to Geshelli Labs where you can pick one of these up for yourself. Again, there's no affiliation, there's no kickbacks to me, it's just a way of saying thank you to them for sending out the gear so I can review it for you. Do keep in mind, there are production delays hitting every manufacturer on the market at the moment, so don't be too hard on them if they're having trouble meeting demand. There might be some delays on ordering through to delivery at the moment, but that's true for every single brand. If you've been lucky enough to get your hands on an early unit of the E2, I'd also love to hear your thoughts down below. Has it impressed you as much as it's impressed me? Do let me know down below, and that means for others watching this review, check the comments down below to see if other people are saying as good things as I am. For now though, if you've enjoyed this review, if you found it useful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like, it's a great help for the channel. But for now, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.